General Hospital spoilers tease that the tragic death of Natalia marks the beginning of a catastrophic chain of events that will reverberate throughout Port Charles, leaving no one untouched by the aftermath. Her demise, caused by a combination of emotional turmoil and alcohol intoxication, seems almost inevitable in the context of her personal struggles. In her desperate attempt to escape the weight of her decisions, the unresolved grief, and the looming danger surrounding her, Natalia makes a tragic choice to drown her sorrows in alcohol. What begins as an attempt to numb the pain ends in a fatal mistake, as the alcohol overwhelms her, and she succumbs to alcohol poisoning. Alone in the isolation of her decisions, Natalia's life comes to a heartbreaking end, and the sense of inevitability that accompanies her death leaves those closest to her in a state of profound shock. Her passing, though deeply personal, quickly becomes a pivotal moment that sparks a wildfire of emotions, regrets, and accusations in the town. The news of her death ripples out, touching those who knew her, from family members like Marco, to those who had an antagonistic relationship with her. The town of Port Charles, already on the brink of chaos due to the ongoing power struggles between Sunny and Sidwell, now finds itself grappling with the tragic loss of a life that many had underestimated. Natalia's death is no longer just a sad chapter in her own story, it becomes a catalyst for much larger issues brewing in the town. For Sunny, the repercussions of Natalia's death are immediate and catastrophic. As the man responsible for ensuring her safety, his failure to protect her and prevent her self-destructive spiral leaves him reeling with guilt and confusion. As the chaos unfolds, it becomes clear that Natalia's death could be manipulated by those with malicious intent. The accusation that Sunny might have played a role in her demise becomes a topic of speculation among those who wish to undermine him. Sidwell, already a formidable foe, senses an opportunity to further destabilize Sunny's grip on the power he has in Port Charles. With tensions running high, the guilt that Sunny feels becomes even more complicated by the ongoing manipulation of his enemies. Meanwhile, Marco, devastated by the loss of his mother, finds himself in the throes of grief, mixed with anger and confusion. The questions surrounding Natalia's death, particularly the circumstances of her drunkenness, cast a shadow over their family. Marco's belief that Sunny might be involved in some way further fuels his anger and desire for revenge. His personal vendetta against Sunny is now bound to the tragic loss of his mother, and he becomes consumed with the need for retribution. As the weight of his grief morphs into something darker, Marco finds himself crossing moral lines in his quest for justice. As this turmoil unfolds, the once solid control that the key players in Port Charles had over their lives begins to slip away. Natalia's death acts as a trigger, pushing the characters into deeper emotional and psychological battles. Michael, already struggling with his own emotional turmoil regarding Wiley and his fractured relationships, must now navigate the fallout of his family's connections to the tragedy. The death of Natalia becomes a focal point of his grief, and it creates more fissures in the already fragile relationships he has with those around him. His attempts to remain composed and keep control of the situation fail as the weight of the loss continues to mount. In the midst of all this chaos, the power dynamics of Port Charles begin to shift in unpredictable ways. What started as a personal tragedy becomes the groundwork for a broader conflict, one that will reshape the town's future. The death of Natalia, while a deeply personal loss for those who loved her, becomes a symbol of the precarious balance of power in Port Charles, a town where the lines between family, loyalty, and betrayal are constantly blurred. For those who had once stood by Sunny, the fallout is just as devastating. People who once supported him, like Jason and others within his inner circle, begin to question their allegiance as they see the cracks in the facade. It becomes clear that no one is immune to the spiraling consequences of the choices made by those in power. As the story unfolds, it becomes increasingly apparent that the death of Natalia is merely the tip of the iceberg. The revelation of dark secrets, lies, and betrayals will come to light, causing relationships to fracture, alliances to be tested, and the very foundation of Port Charles to be shaken. Ultimately, Natalia's death will prove to be more than just a personal loss. It will be the catalyst for a massive power struggle, one that will leave Port Charles irrevocably changed. The battle for control between Sunny and Sidwell will intensify, and as these forces clash, more lives will be lost, and more relationships will be destroyed. The tragedy of Natalia's passing will haunt the town, and the search for justice will take on a darker, more dangerous turn. The question now becomes, who will be left standing when the dust finally settles? And at what cost? Marco's resolve had solidified with each passing day. His grief, his anger, and the crushing sense of betrayal had transformed into something much darker, something he could no longer control. The death of his mother had been the spark that ignited a fire of vengeance that burned relentlessly inside him. His mind had become consumed by the idea that Sunny was the root cause of all the pain, the loss, and the chaos that had unfolded. And now, with everything falling apart around him, Marco knew that the only way to make it stop, the only way to restore some sense of justice, was to bring Sunny down. For months, Marco had quietly watched, gathering the pieces of evidence he needed, piecing together the story that would finally expose Sunny's involvement in the events leading to his mother's untimely death. But it wasn't just about what had happened to her, it was about everything Sunny represented. He had seen Sunny as a protector once, but the walls of that illusion had crumbled, leaving nothing but cold, harsh truth. Now, Sunny was no longer the powerful man he had once admired, he was the villain, the man who would pay for all the pain he had caused. Marco's plan wasn't just about the truth, it was about revenge. And he was prepared to risk everything to see it through. The evidence Marco had gathered was damning. It painted a picture of Sunny's involvement in a series of events that had led to the destruction of Marco's family, particularly the relationship with his mother. He had been methodical in his research, tracing every lead, every inconsistency, every piece of information that would connect Sunny to the crime. And now, with the evidence in his hands, Marco was ready to take the next step. The one thing that had kept him from pulling the trigger earlier, his uncertainty about whether he was doing the right thing, had dissolved. It no longer mattered whether this was personal or professional, it was about retribution. And Marco had become consumed with the desire to see Sunny pay. But with his plan in motion, Marco knew the risks were enormous. By handing over the evidence to Ada Turner, Marco was not just jeopardizing his relationship with Sunny, he was putting himself and everyone close to him in harm's way. Sunny was a dangerous man, capable of anything when his empire was threatened. Marco had seen the lengths Sunny would go to protect his own, and now, he was on the other side of that equation. The very idea of challenging Sunny felt like stepping into the lion's den, but Marco was willing to face the consequences. He wasn't afraid of what Sunny might do. He was driven by the need to avenge his mother's death and expose the truth, no matter the cost. Ada Turner, who had been investigating Sunny's dealings for some time, saw Marco's evidence as the key to unraveling the mystery. She had always suspected that there was more to the story, and now, with Marco's information, she had the chance to finally take Sunny down. However, she couldn't help but question Marco's motivations. Was he truly seeking justice, or was this just a personal vendetta that had clouded his judgment? Marco's obsession with revenge was palpable, and Turner wasn't sure whether this was a case of him seeking justice or him using the legal system as a means to exact his own brand of retribution. As the case gained traction, the pressure mounted, and the lines between right and wrong became increasingly difficult to define. The more Marco delved into the case, the more he found himself questioning his own motives. At times, he could see the line between justice and revenge, but at others, it blurred beyond recognition. He had always prided himself on his ability to maintain control, to stay logical, but now, as the weight of his actions bore down on him, he realized that he had been driven by emotions far stronger than he had ever anticipated. Anger, hatred, grief, these were the forces that had led him down this path. They had clouded his vision, made him see the world in black and white when it was anything but. As the pressure to expose Sunny mounted, so did Marco's internal struggle. He wasn't the same person he had been when he first began this journey. The lines between justice and vengeance had blurred so much that he no longer knew where one ended and the other began. He had become consumed by his need for revenge, and it was eating him alive. The closer he got to the truth, the further he slipped into darkness. But even as Marco was on the verge of unraveling the truth, he had to consider what would happen once the evidence was out in the open. Could he live with the fallout? Would he be able to protect the people he loved from the storm he was about to unleash? The stakes were higher than ever, and Marco knew that this decision, this one final push to bring Sunny to justice, could destroy everything he had left. As the events continued to unfold, Marco found himself facing not only Sunny but his own inner demons. Would he be able to reconcile the man he had become with the man he used to be? Could he find a way to restore some sense of balance to his life, or was it too late? In the end, the war he had started would have far-reaching consequences, and no one, not even Marco, could predict who would emerge from the ashes unscathed. All he knew was that the battle for justice was about to begin, and it was one that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. The situation in Port Charles had reached a boiling point, and the stakes had never been higher. Sunny, once the undisputed ruler of the town, found himself facing a threat that was unlike any he had encountered before. It wasn't just a battle for power or control, this time, it was personal. The forces aligned against him, Sidwell and Marco, were playing a long, calculated game. One that had slowly but surely been creeping up on Sunny without his realizing it. It wasn't just about the criminal empire he had built over the years, it was about everything he had ever worked for. His legacy, his family, his reputation, everything was at risk. Sunny had always been able to read people, to anticipate their moves, and to maintain control of every situation. But this time, the pieces of the puzzle weren't fitting together the way they usually did. Sidwell, with his smooth and methodical approach, had wormed his way into every corner of Port Charles. At first, Sunny had dismissed him as a minor threat, just another player trying to get a foothold in a town he already controlled. But over time, Sunny realized that Sidwell wasn't playing the same game. He wasn't trying to take over Sunny's empire directly, he was playing a far more subtle game, using manipulation and patience to slowly chip away at Sunny's power. With every move, Sidwell was tightening the noose around Sunny's neck, and the mob boss could feel the walls closing in. Then there was Marco. Marco, who had once been a part of Sunny's inner circle, had now become one of his most dangerous enemies. The death of Marco's mother, a tragic event that had rocked the entire town, had set Marco on a path of vengeance that Sunny had never anticipated. Marco's personal vendetta against Sunny was more than just about business, it was emotional, deeply rooted in the pain of losing someone he loved. Sunny had always been able to manipulate situations in his favor, but this was different. Marco's desire for revenge was pure, unrelenting, and it made him unpredictable. He wasn't thinking with the cool calculation that Sunny had come to expect from his enemies. Marco was driven by raw emotion, and that made him a dangerous force to be reckoned with. Together, Sidwell and Marco had created a perfect storm, and Sunny was caught right in the middle of it. The battle for control of Port Charles wasn't just about who would come out on top in the end. It was about survival. Sunny had always been confident in his ability to handle any threat that came his way, but this time, the odds felt different. For the first time in years, Sunny found himself on the defensive, trying to anticipate the next move of enemies who seemed to be one step ahead of him at every turn. It wasn't just the danger from outside forces that Sunny had to contend with. The threat was also coming from within. The trust he had built with his family, particularly with his children, was starting to fracture. Michael, his oldest son, was beginning to question his loyalties to Sunny, and the tension between them was palpable. Michael was no longer willing to blindly follow his father's orders, and that rebellion had created a rift that made everything more complicated. Sunny had spent years building a legacy for his family, but now he was seeing it all come undone because of the choices he had made, choices that Marco and Sidwell were all too ready to exploit. The pressure of trying to keep his family together while also defending his empire was starting to take a toll on Sunny. He could feel himself losing control in ways that were both unsettling and dangerous. For the first time in years, Sunny wasn't sure how much longer he could keep everything together. His empire, his family, and his reputation were all hanging by a thread, and the tension was palpable. The combination of external threats and internal turmoil was pushing Sonny to his breaking point. Every decision he made felt like it could be his last, and every step he took seemed to lead him deeper into a trap of his own making. The weight of the situation was suffocating. With Marco's personal vendetta driving him and Sidwell's manipulative game escalating, Sonny found himself cornered, unable to trust anyone around him. The walls were closing in. And he was running out of options. As the conflict between Sonny and his enemies continued to intensify, one thing became clear: the battle for Port Charles was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Sonny's empire, which had once seemed untouchable, was now at risk of crumbling. The combined forces of Sidwell and Marco were too much for Sonny to handle on his own. And he knew that if he didn't act quickly, everything he had built would be destroyed. But even as the storm raged around him, Sonny knew that he couldn't let go of his control, not without a fight. The only question was, how far was he willing to go to keep everything he had? The stakes had never been higher, and the consequences of this war would not just affect Sonny. They would affect everyone around him, the people he loved, the people he had worked with, and the town of Port Charles itself. As the battle for control escalated, the future of Sonny's empire hung in the balance, and with each passing day, the danger grew ever closer. Sonny would need every ounce of his cunning, strength, and resolve to survive the coming storm. And with Sidwell and Marco closing in, it was anyone's guess who would emerge victorious from the ashes. Eva LaRue's departure from General Hospital marks a seismic shift in the dynamics of Port Charles, especially with the tragic death of her character, Natalia. Natalia's sudden and untimely death is set to send shockwaves through the lives of those around her, leaving a trail of emotional devastation and turmoil. However, the implications of her death reach far beyond personal loss. This is a pivotal moment that exposes just how fragile the power structure in Port Charles is and how the very fabric of Sonny's world can crumble under the weight of one loss. Sonny, who has always prided himself on his ability to maintain control, now finds himself facing a crisis that threatens not just his emotional stability but his position in the underworld. Natalia's death comes at a time when Sonny's empire is already on shaky ground. Between the escalating war with Sidwell and Marco, and the internal struggles within his family, this loss is more than just another tragedy, it is a symbolic breaking point. The emotional toll of losing someone like Natalia, who has connections to so many people in Sonny's life, hits him harder than expected. Natalia's death isn't just the end of a character, it is the beginning of a downward spiral that will take Sonny into darker and more dangerous territory. The grief he feels will bleed into every aspect of his life, clouding his judgment and driving him further into isolation. Sonny, who has always been a calculating and ruthless figure, is faced with a new vulnerability. His grief over Natalia's death leaves him unable to fully focus on the growing threats around him. Marco's anger, already a potent force, now becomes even more dangerous, fueled by the death of his mother and the loss of Natalia. Marco, driven by a need for revenge, sees an opportunity to strike at Sonny through the very thing that Sonny values most, his family. This is not just about Sonny's empire or business, it's about the people Sonny loves. And with the emotional toll of Natalia's death, those around him will suffer. Marco, in his grief, is only too willing to exploit Sonny's pain, leveraging it to undermine him at every turn. But it's not just Marco who is capitalizing on Sonny's vulnerability. Sidwell, the ever-scheming opportunist, sees the perfect opportunity to push Sonny further into a corner. With Natalia's death casting a dark shadow over Sonny's life, Sidwell knows that the time to strike is now. The emotional chaos Sonny is experiencing makes him more prone to mistakes. And Sidwell is ready to exploit those weaknesses. Whether it's manipulating public opinion, orchestrating attacks, or making strategic alliances with Sonny's enemies, Sidwell has made his move. And Sonny is finding it increasingly difficult to manage all the battles happening at once. Meanwhile, the death of Natalia is only intensifying the fractures within Sonny's family. The growing rift between Michael and Sonny, already strained by differing views on the family business, deepens as Sonny's emotional state deteriorates. Michael, who has always admired his father's strength, now sees Sunny in a new light, as a man broken by loss and unable to hold on to the very things he has worked to protect. Michael, with his own troubled relationship with Sunny, begins to question whether following in his father's footsteps is the right path for him. As the family dynamic shifts, the once solid foundation that Sunny built begins to erode. And as the cracks deepen, the consequences will become more pronounced. The collapse of Sunny's family isn't just about personal relationships, it is about power, control, and the very survival of everything Sunny has fought for. The loss of Natalia also comes at a time when Sunny is facing a dangerous reckoning with his past. He has made enemies, alienated friends, and betrayed those closest to him in his pursuit of power. But now, with his empire under siege, those he has wronged are circling like vultures, waiting for the opportunity to strike. Sidwell and Marco are just two of many. And Sunny is realizing that his power has limits. In his grief, he cannot keep up with the constant barrage of attacks from all sides. The very empire he has built is threatened by forces he can no longer control. The emotional toll of losing Natalia, combined with the weight of his many other troubles, begins to take its toll on Sunny's mental and physical well-being. For the first time in a long while, Sunny is questioning everything, his decisions, his choices, and the people he trusted. His grip on power is slipping, and he begins to see the cracks in his carefully constructed world. The man who once ruled Port Charles with an iron fist is now a shell of the person he once was. He can no longer trust those around him, and he cannot protect those he loves from the danger closing in. With each passing day, his world becomes more unstable, more fragile. In the wake of Natalia's death, Sunny's empire is on the brink of collapse. The chaos that follows her death, a combination of grief, revenge, and betrayal, will change the course of Port Charles forever. Sunny, once untouchable, is now a man in crisis, facing the collapse of everything he has worked to build. As Marco seeks vengeance, Sidwell manipulates the situation to his advantage, and Sunny's family grows further apart. Port Charles becomes a powder keg, ready to explode at any moment. The death of Natalia was not just the loss of a character, it was the catalyst for an upheaval that no one could have predicted. The fight for power in Port Charles is no longer just about business, it's about survival, about protecting what's left of the empire, and about the very soul of the town. Sunny's vulnerability, his grief, and his fractured relationship set the stage for a war that will have lasting consequences for everyone involved. The battle is no longer just for control, it's for the future of Port Charles itself. And with each passing day, the destruction grows closer.